Today, we're going to explore two of the most famous and widely debated questions in all of history. When did the Roman Empire fall, and why did the Roman Empire fall? Over the centuries, dozens of thinkers have proposed hundreds of different answers to these questions, and even today, historians do not agree on the answers to either question. Recently, in a triumph of orderliness, one German scholar even compiled an alphabetical list containing no fewer than 210 possible causes for the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, beginning with Aberglaube, superstition, and methodically proceeding through the alphabet to Zölibat, celibacy. Since the influence of Roman civilization still remains hugely important to the modern world in many fundamental areas, such as language, law, architecture, government, and religion, it's worth taking a look at some of the most popular dates and causes that have been proposed for the fall of the Roman Empire and see what merits each has. First, when did Rome fall? Some have argued that 31 BC, in the Battle of Actium, marks the beginning of the end for Rome. Proponents of this date see Octavian's victory at Actium, which led to the fall of the Roman Republic and the establishment of the empire, with Octavian becoming the first emperor under the name Augustus, as being the moment from which everything inevitably went downhill. Most historians, however, seem to accept that despite the switch from republic to empire, Roman civilization not only continued, but did not actually reach a peak until about a century later, during the reign of the five good emperors in the 2nd century AD. The end of that era gives rise to one of the most frequently suggested dates for the fall of Rome, the death of the philosopher-emperor Marcus Aurelius in 180 AD, and the accession to the throne of his mentally unstable son Commodus. The appeal of this date is that it marks a clear transition from a period that is regarded as the golden age of Rome, and a time when the empire was challenged by a variety of disasters, both internal and external. Thus, although the empire clearly continued for some time, AD 180 is often cited as the moment from which affairs assumed an irreversible downward momentum. Interestingly, this seems to be the date favored by Hollywood, since it's the focal point of several high-profile films, including the 1964 classic The Fall of the Roman Empire and the 1999 Oscar-winning epic Gladiator. Even the Romans themselves seem to be aware that this was an important turning point. For example, speaking of this moment, the ancient Roman historian Cassius Dio wrote that, quote, "Our history now descends from a kingdom of gold to one of iron and rust." The next popular date for the fall of Rome comes at the beginning of the 4th century AD, when there were civil wars, one of which ended in 312 with Constantine emerging as the victor and becoming the first emperor to convert to Christianity. Proponents of this date claim that the personal, inward-looking ideology of Christianity was fundamentally antithetical to the outward public focus of Roman civilization. The next set of dates focus on invasions by various barbarian tribes during the 4th century. The death and defeat of the Roman Emperor Valens at the hands of the Goths in AD 378 at the Battle of Adrianople has been put forward as demonstrating the moment when the Western Empire proved incapable of dealing with the threat posed by the barbarians. Another barbarian-related date is AD 410, when King Alaric of the Visigoths invaded Italy, captured the city of Rome, and sacked the ancient capital. Now, in reality, the damage from this event was limited, but there's no denying that in symbolic terms, this was a devastating blow to the image of Rome. Others prefer the slightly later but much more severe sack and thorough looting of Rome by Gaiseric and the Vandals, which occurred in 455 AD. The final major barbarian-related date for the end of Rome is 476 AD, when the last supposedly legitimate Western emperor, Romulus Augustus, was deposed by the barbarian king Odoacer, who then proclaimed himself king of Italy. Some have tried to answer the question by focusing less on military disasters and more on when supposedly legitimate or real Romans passed from the scene. This, however, raises the complicated question of just who counts as a real Roman. Sometimes this leads people to equate the Italians with the Romans, but the Roman army had been largely composed of non-Italians long before any of the dates in question. Similarly, to find an era when the members of the Roman Senate had been selected entirely from Italy, one would have to go all the way back to the time of the Roman Republic. By the 3rd century AD, the emperors were regularly being drawn from the provinces, such as Septimius Severus, who was a North African. Even at Rome's height in the 2nd century AD, Trajan, the first of the 5 good emperors, was of Spanish provincial origins. For much of its history, Rome's emperors, senators, and legionaries were a mixture of peoples from Italy, Europe, Africa, and what today is called the Middle East. In fact, one of the strengths of the Roman Empire and the secret to its longevity was its openness to incorporating foreigners, Romanizing them, and thereby reinvigorating the empire. Perhaps the trickiest question concerning the fall of Rome, however, is that even if the western half of the empire can be considered to have collapsed by around the end of the 5th century AD, the eastern half of the empire just kept cruising along for centuries more. An unbroken succession of Roman emperors ruled over this Eastern Roman Empire, sometimes called the Byzantine Empire, all the way up until 1453, when its capital city of Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks. It might seem odd to speak of a Roman Empire that does not include Rome or Italy, but the Byzantines certainly regarded themselves as real Romans, and pretty much everyone at the time thought so as well. Thus, a legitimate argument can be made that the Roman Empire did not fall until 1453. We're already up to the 15th century in our quest for possible dates for the end of Rome, but it's possible to stretch it even further. If one looks at continuity of titles or self-proclaimed heirs to the Roman Empire, one can push dates for Rome's fall nearly to the present. After all, the title with which Charlemagne, the first great king of medieval Europe, was crowned by the Pope on Christmas Day 8800 was Charles Augustus, Emperor of the Romans. One of the most coveted titles throughout the Middle Ages remained that of the Holy Roman Emperor, and there was a continuous string of such Holy Roman Emperors until the last one was deposed by Napoleon in 1806. Then there are the Russian Tsars, who regarded themselves as heirs to the Roman legacy and whose very name is a corruption of the imperial Roman title Caesar. The last Tsar ruled until the Russian Revolution in 1917. When then did Rome fall? As we've seen, quite reasonable arguments can be made for 31 BC and AD 180, 312, 378, 410, 455, 476, 1453, 1806, and 1917. This long list, spanning almost 2,000 years, by no means exhausts the range of possible dates that can and have been proposed as the end of the Roman Empire. If the date for Rome's fall is contentious, the reasons for its decline and collapse are no less so. Let's now turn to the second question and see if we can find more clarity by considering some of the most influential explanations for Rome's downfall. Many of these suggested dates for Rome's fall center on around the idea that Rome was simply overrun by hordes of barbarians. In this viewpoint, Rome's fall is primarily due to an external factor. This viewpoint was given vivid and succinct expression by one French historian who wrote that, quote, "Roman civilization did not die a natural death, it was murdered." He and others argued that the Roman Empire was essentially sound, but that it fell to repeated and overwhelming attacks by barbarians. Edward Gibbon, the author of the most famous work on Rome's fall, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, also emphasized the importance of this factor, bluntly stating that the Roman world was overwhelmed by a deluge of barbarians. This is an interpretation that is essentially military in nature, that there was a conflict and the Roman military proved inferior to the enemies that they faced. Some variations on this theme laid the blame on related conditions, such as a decline in the quality of the Roman legions, poor generalship, a manpower shortage that left Rome without enough troops or resources to resist, or simply that the numerical superiority of the barbarian armies was irresistible. A second set of explanations concentrates on economic circumstances. Some hypothesize that there was a decline in arable land or unavailable workers, resulting in reduced tax revenue and economic strain. Other scholars have suggested that the soil became exhausted through overcultivation. Still others find evidence for a growing inequality between rich and poor, or a disengagement of local elites from public life, resulting in redirection of resources and diminished civic patronage. Some point to economic stagnation due to over-reliance on slave labor, while others assert that there was a shortage of new slaves to provide adequate labor. The later Roman empires certainly did suffer severe economic crises with periods of steep inflation and debasement of the currency, while at the same time barbarian incursions, civil wars, and supporting the large military all drained and weakened the economy. A third explanation sometimes offered is that the emergence of Christianity as the dominant religion resulted in a decline of Roman power. The church acquired large tracts of land and kept the income for its own purposes, reducing the resources available to the state. Monks, nuns, hermits, and members of the church added up to large numbers of people who, at least in economic terms, were parasites on society and had to be supported by the labor of others. In psychological terms, it has been argued that Christianity, with its emphasis on the next life and finding personal salvation, undermined traditional Roman virtues of service to the state and civic engagement. Christianity offered an alternative power structure, social hierarchy, and value system, which competed with those of the earlier Roman world for allegiance and talent. Some historians have advocated a kind of biological model in which all nations, just like human beings, inevitably go through a natural progression of birth, growth, maturity, decline, and death. In this view, nothing ever remains constant but must follow an inevitable cycle. Some adherents of this theory further believe that prosperity and growth themselves carry within them the inevitable seeds of decay and decline. While plausible arguments can be made for all these explanations, there are others, often repeated ones, that enjoy more popularity than they probably deserve. These include the notions that Rome fell because of lead poisoning from the pipes that carried water, or because of a descent into moral degeneracy. Both explanations are